Atop an anonymous hill in southern England, an exhausted army forms a wall. It is not a wall of stone, but of flesh, wood, and steel. A shield wall, the most formidable infantry defensive system of its time. For 8 endless hours, the invading Norman army, an elite force of knights and archers led by a desperate duke, has crashed against this formation time and again, only to be repelled in a bloody undertow of men and horses. The grass of Senlac Hill is slick with blood, and the air is filled with the screams of the wounded and the metallic sound of defeat. The largest amphibious operation since the time of Julius Caesar, a gamble that will decide the fate of a kingdom, is but a single step from total disaster. The official history, written by the victors, speaks of a glorious conquest, of a manifest destiny blessed by the Pope. But the truth that lies buried beneath Battle Abbey is far more complex and desperate. This is not the story of an inevitable victory. It is the story of an imminent failure. It is the chronicle of how an army on the brink of panic and disintegration, with its legendary knights fleeing down the hill and its leader presumed dead, managed to reverse the course of history. It did not do so with more courage or with better weapons, but with the oldest and most effective weapon of all, a lie, a cunning piece of deception born from the purest survival instinct. The conquest of England by William the Norman was not the result of overwhelming military superiority, but the product of his refusal to accept defeat. He did not win because his troops were better. In fact, for most of the day, they were worse. He won because he was able to improvise in the midst of chaos, to transform disaster into a tactical opportunity. He used his enemy's greatest strength, the iron discipline of the shield wall, and turned it into their fatal weakness, exploiting the pride and impetuousness that hid just beneath the surface. This is the deconstruction of a myth, the true story of how cunning, not strength, seized a throne. Atop the hill stood Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. He was a formidable warrior, a proven commander, and the leader of an army that adored him. But he was also a man at the limit of human endurance. Less than 3 weeks earlier, he was more than 200 miles to the north, where he had faced and annihilated another invading army, a horde of Norwegian Vikings led by the legendary Harold Hardrada at the brutal Battle of Stamford Bridge. Upon learning of William's landing in the south, Harold had subjected his army to a forced march back, covering nearly 30 miles a day. He was a victorious king, but he and his men were physically and mentally exhausted. Harold's army, some 7,000 strong, was a reflection of its king, tough, resilient, and traditional. It was composed almost entirely of infantry. Its elite corps was the Huscarls, professional warriors in the king's personal guard, armed with the fearsome two-handed Danish axe, a weapon capable of decapitating a horse with a single blow. Their defining tactic was the shield wall, a defensive formation in which men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields interlocked, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. Their motivation was the purest of all. They were not fighting for glory or conquest, but to defend their land, their homes, and their crown from a foreign invader who came to claim it all. The invader was William, Duke of Normandy. He was known as the Bastard, a title that reflected not only his illegitimate birth, but also his character. He was a ruthless, cunning, and absolutely merciless military leader, forged in decades of war to secure his own duchy. William believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne, based on an alleged promise from the previous king. He had spent a year gathering a fleet and an army, obtaining the Pope's blessing, and staking his entire future and that of Normandy on this single, risky invasion. For him, retreat was not an option. Defeat would mean total ruin and likely death. He was cornered by his own ambition. William's army was the embodiment of modern 11th century warfare. It was a combined arms force of about 7,000 men, which included large contingents of archers and infantry. But its main weapon, the hammer he expected to crush the English resistance, was his heavy cavalry. Thousands of Norman knights, men in armor from head to toe, mounted on great war horses and trained to charge in close formation with lance couched. However, William's arrogance led him to fatally underestimate his opponent. He was convinced that his knights, the ultimate shock weapon of continental Europe, would simply ride over the Saxon infantry. He was not prepared for the reality of a disciplined shield wall on a steep hill. The choice of battlefield was Harold's first tactical stroke of genius. Arriving in the area before William, He selected a nearly perfect defensive position, a hill known as Senlac Ridge. The crest was wide enough to deploy his entire army, and its flanks were protected by steep, wooded terrain. Most importantly, the slope leading to the summit was steep enough that any cavalry charge up it would lose all its momentum and energy. The powerful Norman war horses would be reduced to an exhausting trot, turning their riders into easy targets for the spears and, above all, the fearsome Danish axes of the Huscarls. The hill neutralized William's greatest advantage before the battle even began. However, Harold's greatest strength, his confidence as a victorious commander, also led him to make his greatest mistake. Upon arriving at Hastings, he made the fatal decision to seek battle immediately. His army was exhausted from the 400-mile march, and the two battles fought in less than a month. Had he waited in London for just a few more days, he could have gathered thousands of reinforcements from the local militias and allowed his veterans to rest. Meanwhile, William, confined to a small beachhead, would have faced growing supply problems. Harold's haste for a decisive confrontation was a strategic miscalculation that would cost him the kingdom. To see how this mistake was nearly overcome by the incredible resilience of his men, subscribe and give a like, because you are about to witness 9 hours of medieval carnage. The battle began at 9 in the morning on October 14th, 1066. William's plan was simple and followed the Norman playbook. First, his archers loosed a shower of arrows to soften the enemy lines. However, the upward angle in the Saxon shield wall caused the arrows to bounce off harmlessly or fly over the Englishmen's heads. The first phase of the attack was a complete failure. Next, William sent his infantry up the hill. They were met with a storm of spears, stones, and axes. The fighting was brutal and close-quartered, but the Saxons, from their superior position, drove the Normans back with heavy losses. Frustrated, William unleashed his ultimate weapon, his knights. Charge after charge, the elite of the Norman cavalry launched themselves up the hill, their lances aimed at the heart of the shield wall. And charge after charge, they were thrown back. The shield wall held firm, a living fortress. Horses shied at the forest of spears and the din of shields, and the Huscarls carved through them, their two-handed axes felling riders from their mounts as if they were trees. The sight of proud Norman knights being slaughtered by foot soldiers was something few in Europe had ever seen. Harold's army seemed, indeed, invincible. For hours, this bloody pattern repeated. The Norman attacks, uncoordinated and exhausting, crashed against the Saxon rock to no visible effect. Norman morale began to falter. In the early afternoon, after another failed assault, the left wing of William's army, composed of Bretons and Angevins, finally broke. Panicked, they turned and fled down the hill, pursued by a shower of missiles. Panic is contagious on a battlefield, and the flight of the left began to spread to the Norman center. The invasion was on the verge of total collapse. To make matters worse, amidst the confusion and chaos, a rumor spread that was a death sentence for any medieval army. The Duke has fallen, William is dead. The news spread like wildfire, turning panic into a full-blown rout. Soldiers who had fought bravely for hours now only thought of saving their own lives. William's great gamble, his dream of conquering a kingdom, was dissolving into a humiliating defeat. This was the lowest point of the battle for the Normans, the moment when history almost took a completely different course. It was then that William proved why he was a great leader. Seeing the disaster unfold before his eyes, he galloped directly toward his fleeing troops. To prove the rumor false, he took off his helmet, showing his face to his men, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Look at me well, I am alive, and by the grace of God, I shall conquer." This act of personal bravery and charismatic leadership stopped the flight in its tracks. The men, seeing their duke alive and defiant, regained their courage and began to regroup. But William did more than just stop the panic. He observed. As he rallied his men, he noticed something crucial. A large contingent of English soldiers from the right flank, mostly militiamen without the discipline of the Huscarls, had broken the shield wall formation. Carried away by the thrill of the chase, they had rushed down the hill after the fleeing Bretons, exposing themselves on level ground. William watched as his regrouped cavalry surrounded and slaughtered these undisciplined Englishmen. In that moment of disaster, an idea came to him. He had discovered the only crack in Harold's armor, the impetuousness of his men. William's genius lay not in his original plan, which was a failure, but in his ability to improvise. He decided to turn the accidental flight of his left wing into a deliberate tactic. He ordered his knights to perform a series of feigned retreats. It was an incredibly difficult and dangerous maneuver, requiring iron discipline from his horsemen not to turn a fake retreat into a real one. The goal was to tempt the English, to lure them into breaking their perfect defensive formation and coming down from the safety of the hill. The trap worked perfectly. The English, who had been on the defensive for more than 6 hours, were tired, frustrated, and eager for victory. Seeing the Norman knights flee once more, they believed the battle was won. Ignoring orders to hold the line, groups of Saxon soldiers broke the shield wall and charged down the hill in a disorderly pursuit. It was exactly what William had been waiting for. The greatest strength of the English, their discipline, had finally cracked under the pressure. Once the English were on level ground, the Norman cavalry turned and charged. Now, on favorable terrain and against a disorganized infantry without the protection of their interlocked shields, the knights were unstoppable. The slaughter was terrible. The English, caught in the open, were ridden down and cut to pieces. Time and again, William repeated the tactic, and time and again, the English fell for the trap, slowly bleeding the strength and cohesion of the shield wall. The battle, which had been a static siege, transformed into a series of chaotic skirmishes all over the slope. The shield wall, no longer a continuous line, now had multiple breaches. William ordered his archers to shoot in a high arc so that the arrows would fall vertically on the Englishmen's heads, bypassing the shields. It was in this chaotic moment, late in the afternoon, that fate sealed the battle. King Harold, fighting in the center of the line, was mortally wounded. The legend, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, says he was struck in the eye by an arrow. Other sources suggest he was cut down by a group of Norman knights who finally managed to break the shield wall around his standard. Whatever the exact cause, the king's death was the final blow. Seeing their leader fall, the morale of the remaining Huscarls, who had been fighting valiantly around their king, finally broke. Organized resistance collapsed. The battle continued until dusk. The Huscarls, true to their oath, fought to the last man around the body of their fallen king. The militia, however, broke and fled into the darkness. William's victory, which had seemed impossible just hours before, was now total. He had won not with brute force, but with deception. He had survived the brink of the abyss and emerged victorious thanks to a well-executed lie, proving that in a battle for a kingdom, the mind is a sharper weapon than any sword. The immediate result of the Battle of Hastings was the near-total annihilation of the ruling class of Anglo-Saxon England in a single, bloody day. King Harold Godwinson and his 2 brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, lay dead on the battlefield. Alongside them, the majority of the kingdom's nobility and warrior elite, the Huscarls, had been exterminated. Total casualties numbered in the thousands on both sides, but for the English, the loss was catastrophic and irreplaceable. It was not just an army that had been defeated, but an entire power structure that had ruled England for centuries. The fate of the defeated commander, King Harold, became the stuff of legend. His body, according to accounts, was so horribly mutilated in the final battle that he could not be recognized. It was his lover, Edith the Swan Neck, who finally identified him by secret marks on his body known only to her. William, in a gesture some consider respectful and others calculatedly pragmatic, supposedly refused to hand over his body to his mother for a Christian burial, though later accounts claim he was eventually interred at Waltham Abbey. His death marked the abrupt and violent end of the line of Anglo-Saxon kings. For William, the victory was not a clean celebration, but the end of a brutal and desperate struggle that lasted 9 grueling hours, from dawn until dusk. His army was battered, his losses were severe, and he had been on the verge of losing everything. The conquest was no military parade. It was a butchery won by the narrowest of margins, thanks to on-the-field improvisation and the enemy's mistakes. The image of an easy, divinely ordained conquest was a piece of propaganda carefully constructed after the fact to legitimize an outcome that had been anything but certain. The Norman conquest, sealed at Hastings, was the single most transformative event in English history. It was not merely a change of dynasty. It was a cultural, social, and political revolution. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility was completely dispossessed and replaced by a new, French-speaking aristocracy loyal to William. With them came the continental feudal system, which reorganized land ownership and the structure of society. The English church was also reformed and brought under tighter control from Rome. In essence, William imported a new ruling class and a new system of government, redesigning England in the image of his Norman duchy. The most lasting impact of the battle can be heard to this day. The conquest transformed the English language forever. For the next 300 years, Norman French became the language of the court, law, and government, while Old English, the language of the Saxons, was relegated to the status of a peasant tongue. However, instead of disappearing, the two languages slowly merged, creating an extraordinarily rich hybrid language. Norman words for food, beef, pork, law, judge, jury, and government, parliament, crown, were layered onto the Germanic vocabulary of Old English, creating the modern English language we know today. The Battle of Hastings became the year zero of modern English history. It is, to this day, the last time a foreign invasion has successfully conquered England. This fact alone gives it an almost mythical status. It became the starting point for the genealogy of the British monarchy. William the Bastard became William Thurthur, the Conqueror, and every king and queen of England since, including the current royal family, are his direct descendants. The battle didn't just change a country, it created a new line of kings and a new trajectory for history. The narrative of the battle, immortalized in the extraordinary Bayeux Tapestry, is a perfect example of how history is written by the victors. William's campaign is presented as a just enterprise, blessed by God to reclaim a throne that was rightfully his. Harold is portrayed as a perjuring usurper. The reality of a desperate battle, won by deception and luck, is polished into a story of inevitability and divine right. The deconstruction of this myth does not diminish the battle's importance, but reveals the deeper truth, that history is rarely as neat as its victors would have us believe. William's campaign to conquer England was marked from the very first moment by his ability to turn disaster into opportunity. The first thing he did upon landing on the beach at Pevensey was to trip on a stone and fall flat on his face in the sand. His men, superstitious, held their breath, fearing it was a terrible omen, a sign from heaven that their enterprise was doomed to fail. But William, thinking with astonishing speed, pushed himself up with his hands full of dirt and sand, raised them to the sky, and shouted in a voice of thunder, "By the splendor of God, I have taken possession of England with both my hands." In that single gesture lies the key to understanding his victory. He transformed a simple accident, a moment of clumsiness, into an act of prophecy, a declaration of intent. He did the exact same thing on the battlefield of Hastings. When his army was crumbling and panic was spreading, he did not see the end, but an opportunity. He saw his enemies in discipline and turned it into his sharpest weapon. The conquest of England did not begin with a firm step, but with a fall, and it was not won with a heroic charge, but with a cunning lie. The story of 1066 is not one of manifest destiny, but of a man who refused to let omens or reality stand in the way of his will.